Man, I was out like a light. In other words, what happened was I got up this morning, and like most mornings, I didn't sleep that good last night, and some nights I sleep good, and some nights I don't. But for some reason, last night just couldn't seem to get to sleep, so sat up for a long time, and then kind of slept in bed, and then slept on the floor, and then slept on the couch, and then slept in the chair, and then slept on the couch, and then basically moved around. And sometimes, what happens then is the next day, I am fine in the morning, but after about an hour or two, I take a nap. And boom, today was one of those days that I was out like a light. So it feels so different to take a nap and then wake up and try to get going again. But in Lunch and Learn, we like to look at what God is saying to us so that we can pause in our day to recap and recount to ourselves those things that maybe we didn't pay attention to in the morning, but by the time noon gets here, we know we need to take some time to review and redo what it is God is saying to you and to me today. So looking at that, it says that the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods, to every man according to his several ability. Know ye not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants are you to whom you obey? That's an interesting point that sometimes I think gets lost with Americans or with people in America today. If you are hired by someone, then you are hired to do a job. God expects you to do what you are hired to do. In other words, it's not, if you go to work for McDonald's, say, and you don't like McDonald's, but you just took the job anyways, and then while you're there, you're whining and complaining and not doing a good job, you're not doing that unto McDonald's to make them look bad. You're doing it unto God. You see, you are a witness whether you like it or not. You are an example if you've called upon the name of the Lord to be his light to a generation living in darkness. You are the salt of the earth. If you've been hired by a corporation to do your job, then you're hired with expectations that if you are paid, then that's what you get paid to do. Now, the interesting thing about what Jesus is saying here, that if you're paid by someone, then that's who you are. In other words, one of the interesting things is one of the pastors, when Chuck Smith died, was given a question. I mean, people come up and ask pastors all kinds of weird, wacko questions. And I had to laugh because he was asked kind of a leading question about being a pastor. He wanted, somebody called him up and says, what do I do? I'm in the military, and what do I do about being in the military? And he said, do what you're told, and left it at that. He didn't say anything more or less, because that was wisdom. Because you see, personally, I can't imagine a Christian joining the military. I don't know how they do. I don't know what they do. That's not for me to say. I know I did, and that was something I shouldn't have done when I was saved. But if I was put in a position of having to kill an enemy instead of love an enemy, I would question, how could I love an enemy if I'm killing them? So it puts me in a predicament that God never intended me to be put into. And so I found it interesting that if I'm a violent man, then I probably am going to join the military. But if I'm a peaceful man, what am I doing in the military? Obviously, God can use people in the military for that reason, being salt, being light. God can use people in the police force for the same reason. God can use you wherever you are for the same reason, that you are the salt of the earth. But if you are taking a job, you're reflecting not only on yourself, and that's who you are, but reflecting on God and demonstrating what he is. In other words, if you're a stripper at a, being a stripper in a bar might not be the best place to be to earn a living. Playing sports as an athlete, I'm not so sure that's something that reflects well on demonstrating the maturity of what God would want to do in your life. What you are paid for is what you have to do. So you really don't have the freedom to argue or debate about the things that are going on if you are hired by someone. And one of the things that people have found out about Facebook is that employers are looking at Facebook at their employees. And if their employees are mouthing off about their employment, they are becoming ex-employees. Because that's what it means to be whosoever servant you yield your member thereof, that's the servant you are. So also, likewise, if you are sinning, then you're a sinner. If you are lying, you're a liar. If you're telling the truth, you're a truther. In those ways, then politicians find themselves at compromise, because really, politics wasn't meant to be about lying, and yet it is. It wasn't meant to be about slandering or arguing or debating, and yet it's become that. It was supposed to be about representation, but it's not that. So we need to think about that when we deal with the reality of who we are in being Christians in a world that's full of darkness. All these work that one and self-same Spirit, dividing to every man several as he will, the manifestation of the Spirit to give it to every man to profit for everyone. As every man has received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. It is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. Unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall much be required. And to whom men shall have committed much, of him shall they ask the more. Who is sufficient unto these things? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In other words, our life is, as Christians, determined a lot by what the Spirit of God is doing in your life. If you have been given a lot of, ability by the Spirit of God, then you can accomplish many things. But I got an interesting perspective on limited versus abundant. I have these flowers that maybe you can see them. This particular set is still blooming somewhat. It's called a perennial. I think perennials are the ones that don't come back every year, and annuals are the ones that come back every year. I could be wrong. But the point being is that I bought them flowering, and they look pretty, and I put them out, and kept them for about 2 or 3 days, and they look great. Then they began to kind of wrinkle and look bad, beginning to die. Well, the other pot that's like this has one that is flat. I mean, it's died and died. I mean, it's just like ugly. So I pulled it out. It lasted 4 days, maybe 3 days. And then I had to throw it away. Now, I spent $1 on it, approximate, per plant, approximately. That's a bad investment in my personal opinion, because I don't like plants like this that don't last very long. I have other plants that I've kept since last year, and they've been cut back and repotted, and so I have lots of plants from them. These suckers, I just want to throw it over the counter. I want to toss it over the side, and say, forget it, I'll never grow those again. And so my wife wrote down the plant name, or whatever, I think, and she's never going to let me buy those kinds again. Because, I expect a little more than that out of plants that I want to have for her enjoyment as well as mine. And then also that we can, have some color to, like, our porch, or as we move them into the bedroom, and I think it affects us when we see flowering plants. Now, that plant can only do so much. It has a limited function and a limited capability. If it does do to the full spectrum or the full ability that God has placed within it, then it has accomplished its purpose. That's what it's like a lot of times for Christians. Not everyone's called to be, ministers to, let's say, the world. Not everyone's called to be an evangelist or a disciple or a teacher. Some are just called to be people, like little flowers that maybe they only blossom for a day. Maybe they only bloom for an hour. Maybe like that one plant that, every 50 years it gets one blossom, but in the meantime it doesn't do anything, you know. And then all of a sudden every 50th year it sends up a stem and then opens up, and it's like that stink plant. The stink plant, I think, does that every 50 years or something like that. And so too some cactus and some other plants. But that's what we need to recognize about ourselves, is that if God has given us a limited sphere of influence, then just do what God has given you to do. If you're a person who is only hired to, say, clean bathrooms and toilets and, janitorial work, then be content therein. If God has called you to witness while you're doing that, like Stephen was hired technically to wait on tables, to take care of the body of Christ, to be kind of like a servant, and somehow we find him out witnessing and getting into trouble. Not sure if he did that on purpose or God used him that way, but either way, we find him as a martyr, and God blesses him by allowing Stephen to see before he dies the Lord seated at the right hand of the Father. Where you're at doesn't mean that's all you're ever going to be. It simply means that's what your skill set or your capability is at this time. If you're learning and growing and developing, God will use you and transplant you maybe many times in your life to do other things. Or he may not do, and you may be only there to possibly teach your children, or help your husband, or be a single parent. But whatever it is that God has caused you to do according to the Spirit of God within you, then he's going to give you the ability to do it to the full measure of what you're able to do, and then a little bit extra. God always takes you one step a little bit farther than you think you can do. Kind of like in the Marine Corps when they teach you can go farther than you think you can when you're motivated. And they can motivate you. That's what it is with God's love and God's mercy and God's Spirit. God does these things so that he can bring to us an awareness that our life, first of all, has meaning. And the meaning of life is to be able to recognize eternity is available to us if we would just acknowledge the salvation God has brought for us and bought for us. And if we do that, then we have an eternity yet still to come where so much more will be added on to what we think of as so limited our life may be at this time. Our limitations are not the expectations in eternity. Our limitations are opportunities to fulfill in a greater way, to a degree of fulfillment, than those who have great responsibilities that never measure up to everything they should be doing. I know that there's a lot of people that often try to do more than they should. But I'm trying to talk to you about doing less than what maybe you really are more important than being less important. Because there's too many people that try to do more than what they should. And frankly, they wind up killing the plant. If you overgrow a plant, if you overwater it, if you over anything on a plant, they die. So the plant itself, by itself, will grow itself. And sometimes you got to allow that in your life to just grow within your ability and capability, rather than looking at it as a limitation or a, expectation of not doing more or being more. Because if you're fulfilled as I used to say this all the time, a little teacup of faith, if it's filled to the brim and overflowing, feels the same way as a giant gallon of water that's overflowing. Neither one has a difference of feeling to the overwhelming and overflowing of their ability. And that's what God does by his Spirit. You may think and you may never know that you've done so much, or know that you've done so little, if you have in fact fulfilled all that God had wanted to do in you. Paul was able to say at the end of his life, I have run the race, I have finished the course. There is laid up for me a crown of rejoicing at the appearing of our Lord. Now, I don't know what God has in store for you. I know if God has given you a lot, he expects a lot. If God has given you a little, he don't expect much. And what he does expect is simply that we give all that we have to him. If we then give all that we are, then all that we are is enough. And we'll find that he'll be satisfied with no matter what we give him if we learn to let go and let God lead us. Because it's too often the person who's trying to do too much that doesn't recognize that too little could have been the problem, but too much is just as bad as too little. So somewhere along the way, listen to what the Lord may say. He may tell you when you're in the middle of doing something, stop. Don't reach that extra mile. Don't go farther than what you're able to do. For me today, that's what happened, is that, I got up early. I had not slept enough, but I'd recorded a couple VidDevos, and did a couple new ones, like Utah Today was a new VidDevo series, and I was excited about it and recorded it. We did VidDevo Sunrise, and that was exciting, what God was saying, and I went inside and I was like, wow, kind of piddled for a few minutes, getting things established on Facebook and in the internet and passing it on. And then it was kind of like just, I reached the end of my rope. I was no longer able to do more because God wanted me to do less. So I went into my bedroom and left these plants out here and went to sleep. That is God's will sometimes. Sometimes when you need rest, God says, be still or rest. Sometimes when you think you want to do more, God may say, do less. Don't ever think that less isn't more or more isn't less, because whichever way you go with it, if it isn't the Lord directing you, then really you're doing your own thing, which may cause and bring, as we talked about one of these plants doing, you might wind up overextending yourself and not being the blossom or the bloom that God intended you to be today. You can only minister so much of what God has given you. And when you're empty, you're empty. It's not a life of being able to always, walk on water. It isn't a life of always being able to heal every sick person. It isn't a life of always being miraculous. It isn't a life of always being joy-filled, though you could be. But it is a life of walking and talking and living with Jesus daily, so that we could be his workmanship, his blossom. We could bloom in his time, his will, and his way. I pray today that you may find the balance in your life, so that you don't get like what most Gentiles do, or most Christians do, or most Jews do, or most Gentiles do, in wanting to be so much more when God says less is best.